Welcome to the Woden Files, where we go back to the original sources, the old claims, and the historical questions people stopped asking. I am A, and with me is my co-host, I.
It is so great to be here. We have a really remarkable historical puzzle to dismantle today.
We really do.
Yeah, it's basically a perfect case study in how history gets remembered, or I guess misremembered, and sometimes entirely reinvented to just serve a narrative.
Right, exactly. Because look, if you spend enough time on historical internet forums, or, if you ever find yourself falling down one of those late night social media rabbit holes about Norse mythology.
Which happens to the best of us.
Oh, totally. But if you do that, you will eventually be hit with what looks like an undeniable explosive fact. You'll see a screenshot of a text or like a viral video essay claiming that the ancient, highly revered Icelandic historian Ari the Learned explicitly wrote that the Norse god Odin was the, quote, king of the Turks.
Yeah, and it's always presented as this massive bombshell.
It really is. It sounds so authoritative because it cites a very specific 12th century historian. It names the chief of the Norse pantheon, and it ties them to this very specific real-world geography.
Right, a geography that feels completely alien to Viking Age Scandinavia.
Exactly. I feel like you've just stumbled onto this suppressed secret history of the world. But my co-host is here to tell you that this perfect internet fact has one glaring, insurmountable problem.
Yeah, pretty massive problem. Because while that sentence actually does exist in an ancient Icelandic manuscript, the internet has simply swapped out the main character.
They just changed the name.
Completely. The original text never mentions Odin. Not once. The figure named in that specific text is Yngvi.
Yngvi, that right there is the linchpin of this entire myth.
Yeah, the sentence itself is real, but modern internet culture has essentially copy-pasted the wrong god into the quote.
Right. And the goal of our deep dive today is to pull apart this whole historical game of telephone. We are going to track how a single line from the 1100s mutated into a 21st century viral claim.
Because what we find when we actually dig into the manuscripts and the geography of the medieval mind and the science of linguistics is a truth that is far stranger.
And infinitely more fascinating than just a neat packaged internet meme.
Absolutely. The mechanics of how this particular myth spread are incredibly revealing.
How so?
Well, the claim that, Ari the Learned said Odin was king of the Turks, it thrives in the digital age precisely because it's clean. It's a clean historical fact.
Right. Fits neatly into a tweet.
Exactly. It offers this provocative contrarian headline. However, anyone who spends any amount of time in the archives knows that clean historical facts, especially from the medieval period, should immediately trigger alarm bells.
Oh, 100%. When I see a pristine, perfectly aligned historical fact, my immediate thought is that someone has scrubbed away the context.
They've sanitized it.
Yeah. It is the historical equivalent of, heavily filtered, edited photography. If a quote from the Middle Ages perfectly answers a highly politicized modern question about race or borders or origins, it almost always means the text has been stripped of its original worldview.
That is a great way to put it. The danger lies in our modern desire for certainty, right? We want ancient texts to function like modern encyclopedias.
Which they just don't.
Not at all. When we look at medieval texts, we are dealing with fragmented survivals, profound political biases, shifting definitions of words, and honestly, a geographical framework that is utterly alien to our own.
So when people swap Yngvi for Odin, they're not just making a typo.
No, they are taking a sledgehammer to all of that nuance.
But, it makes sense from a purely narrative perspective, doesn't it? Yngvi, king of the Turks, is an interesting piece of trivia. But Odin, king of the Turks...
That's blockbuster material.
Exactly, it's a cinematic hook. But it makes me wonder about the mechanics of the swap itself. Because the leap from Yngvi to Odin isn't completely random, is it?
No, not at all.
They didn't just pull Odin out of thin air to make the quote sound cooler. There has to be a historical reason those two names blurred together over the centuries.
There is. The conflation of those figures is a direct result of how Scandinavian legend evolved over several centuries.
Okay, walk us through that.
So, in later traditions, the names Yngvi, Freyr, and Odin all became heavily entangled with the deep ancestral origins of Sweden. As these oral traditions were formalized into written sagas, the simple genealogical lists expanded.
Right. They didn't just stay lists.
Exactly. A list of names transformed into a story of an ancient migration, and that migration narrative eventually solidified into a full-blown national origin story.
So they kind of just blended together.
Yeah, in the minds of later readers, these distinct figures collapsed into a singular archetype, the archetype of the ancient Eastern founder.
Because Yngvi and Odin both end up serving the exact same narrative function, right? The ancient divine forefather from a distant land.
Precisely. So someone down the line just casually swapped them out, prioritizing the emotional impact of the story over the literal reality of the ink on the page.
Right. But to truly unweave this tangled web, we need to completely ignore the internet noise for a second. We need to go straight to the absolute first link in the chain.
We have to look at what the original author, Ari the Learned, was actually doing.
So tell us about Ari. Who is this guy?
Ari is a foundational figure. He was writing a text called Icelandic, or the Book of Icelanders, in the early 12th century, roughly between the years 1120 and 1133.
Wow. Okay. That is old.
It is widely considered the oldest known history book written in Old Norse.
Let's set the stage for you listening, because the physical reality of what Ari was doing is crucial to understanding this. Imagine Iceland in the 1120s. It has only been settled for about 2.5 centuries at this point.
Right. It's still a relatively young society.
Exactly. It is isolated, it's frigid, and it's physically disconnected from the centers of European power. But it has this staggeringly rich, vibrant oral tradition.
People are reciting genealogies, laws, and epic poetry around the hearth fires.
Yeah, and Ari's monumental task was to capture that ephemeral oral world and bind it to vellum. He is trying to create a definitive physical record of who the Icelanders are and where they came from.
And at the very end of this remarkably concise history, Ari provides an appendix. He writes out the long ancestral line of the people of Breifjordur, which was a prominent region in western Iceland.
And what's the purpose of this list?
This list is intended to trace their elite lineage all the way back to the dawn of their history. And the very first line of that genealogy is where we find our infamous quote.
Okay, hit us with it. What does he actually write?
He writes, quote, Yngvi, king of the Turks, Urer, king of the Swedes, Freyr, Fjolnir, end quote. And then the list just continues meticulously through the generations of the legendary Yngling dynasty.
Wow.
Yeah, it eventually lands on historical figures and finally ends with Ari himself.
So there it is, just in black and white. Yngvi, king of the Turks.
Not Odin.
Not Odin. The text moves directly from Yngvi in the east to Urer in Sweden and down the line. But here's where we have to stop and fundamentally recalibrate how we understand this list.
Because it's not a modern family tree.
Exactly. An Icelander in the 12th century does not view a family tree the way you or I do today. When we think of tracing our ancestry, we are thinking in terms of modern biology and bureaucracy.
Right, census records, birth certificates.
Genetic DNA tests that tell you what percentage of your DNA originates in a specific modern geographical zone. But Ari's list operates on an entirely different plane of reality.
It is what historians refer to as a medieval ancestry structure, and you're completely correct that applying a modern biological framework to it is, well, it's a catastrophic error.
It just doesn't work.
No. When you read Ari's list, you're looking at a hierarchy that exists at this surreal intersection of mythology, political propaganda, and historical memory.
All mixed together.
Yes. In a single, continuous line, Ari places divine figures, legendary founder ancestors, reigning human kings, and local Icelandic chieftains. They all just stand shoulder to shoulder.
It's so wild to think about. Like, imagine logging onto a modern genealogy website, right? You trace your family line back through the 1900s, the 1800s, the 1700s.
You find a great-great-grandfather who was a local blacksmith or something.
Exactly, a blacksmith. But in Ari's world, you keep clicking back, and suddenly the blacksmith's grandfather is a semi-mythical Swedish king.
Right?
And you click back again, and the king's father is Freyr, a literal god of fertility.
It's incredible.
And right above the god, sitting at the absolute pinnacle of the family tree, is a foreign king from a mysterious eastern land. It completely shatters the modern boundary between the sacred and the historical.
Which brings up the core interpretive challenge here. Because Ari includes Yngvi, king of the Turks, as his direct ancestor, a modern reader might mistakenly assume Ari was making a literal biological claim to Middle Eastern or Central Asian descent.
Which he wasn't doing.
He was not. The text is not a passport. In the medieval period, a royal genealogy was an instrument of legitimacy. It was a claim to power.
So it's about status.
Entirely. Claiming descent from ancient foreign kings and divine beings was a way for elite families to justify their elevated status above the common freeman.
That completely flips the modern idea of nationalism on its head, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Because today, a nationalist movement usually wants to claim they sprouted directly from their own local soil. They want to say, we have been here since the dawn of time.
Right, the whole blood and soil concept.
But Ari is doing the exact opposite. He is building a massive, enduring monument to Icelandic culture, but he is emphatically insisting that the cornerstone of that monument was imported from the opposite end of the known world.
Yes, from the east.
The crucial takeaway for you listening here isn't the specific DNA of Ari's ancestors, right? It is the fact that his map of origins does not begin in Iceland.
It does not begin in Norway either, which is where the Icelanders primarily migrated from. It doesn't even begin in Sweden. The very first geographical pin Ari drops on his ancestral map is an Eastern ruler title attached to Yngvi. He deliberately anchors the entire Scandinavian royal lineage far outside of Scandinavia.
He is drawing this direct, unbroken line of authority from the distant, exotic East, moving through the divine realms, filtering through the ancient kings of Sweden, crossing the ocean to the early settlers of Iceland, and flowing straight into his own pen.
And that underlying historical pattern is what truly demands investigation. Why did northern writers in the Middle Ages continually turn their gaze toward the East when attempting to explain the ancient origins of their people?
Yeah, what was it about the Eastern horizon that held such profound ancestral gravity?
That is the million-dollar question.
But before we can really answer it, we have to address the elephant in the room. Because if Ari only provided a bare-bones list of names, just a skeletal genealogy starting with Yngvi, where did the incredibly rich cinematic story of Odin leading his people out of Asia actually come from?
Right. The narrative everyone knows.
Yeah, the myth of Odin fleeing the Roman Empire is the story everyone is familiar with. So to find the source of that narrative, we have to fast forward about a century past Ari the Learned.
We do. We have to move to the early 13th century and look at a man named Snorri Sturluson.
Ah, Snorri. He is arguably the most influential single author in the preservation of Norse mythology.
Unquestionably. I mean, around the year 1225, Snorri wrote this massive historical work known as the Heimskringla, which is essentially a history of the Norwegian kings.
And the Ynglinga saga is in there, right?
Yes, the very first section of that epic work is the Ynglinga saga. Snorri was definitely familiar with the bare genealogical lists provided by earlier writers like Ari, but Snorri does not just give his readers a list of names.
He's a storyteller.
Exactly. He operates as an author, a historian, and a mythographer. He provides the sprawling world that surrounds those names. He constructs a comprehensive history of an eastward origin and a massive migration.
He is the one who injects the world building. He gives us the geopolitical stakes, the cities, and the motivations.
Let us look closely at Snorri's text. He writes that there was an ancient land called Iceland, located east of the Tanais.
Which is a real river, right?
Yes, it's the river we know today as the Don River, which empties into the Sea of Azov in modern-day Russia. So within Iceland, Snorri says there was a magnificent capital city called Asgard, and ruling over this physical city in the east was a powerful, wealthy chieftain named Odin.
And just like that, Odin enters the historical record, not as a sky god with one eye hanging on the world tree, but as a wealthy human warlord residing in a specific geographical location east of the Don River.
Which is a huge shift.
It is. This is a process called euhemerism, right? The idea that mythological gods were actually just highly successful ancient human kings whose deeds were exaggerated over centuries until they were worshipped as divine.
Precisely. You have to remember, Snorri was a Christian writing in a Christian era. He could not present Odin as a literal god, but he deeply respected his ancestral traditions.
So euhemerism was his workaround.
Exactly. It allowed him to preserve the great figures of the Norse past by rationalizing them into ancient human heroes. And Snorri expands heavily on Odin's domain. He states that Odin possessed immense territories in Turkland.
Turkland, there's that word again.
Yes. But Snorri introduces a massive geopolitical catalyst that fundamentally shifts the narrative, and that is the expansion of the Roman Empire.
This is where the story turns into a full-blown historical epic. Because Snorri writes that the relentless expansion of the Roman emperors was subjugating nations across the world, right?
Pushing kings and entire tribes from their traditional homelands.
It was this intense geopolitical pressure from the south that forced Odin to abandon his great estates in Turkland. He gathers his followers, leaves his brothers to govern Asgard, and leads a massive, arduous migration northward, eventually bringing his people into Scandinavia.
It is a profound rationalization of myth. It transforms a localized pantheon of gods into a story of migration, conquest, and refugee survival.
But we have to carefully observe the contrast between these two texts we've just examined, because this is exactly where the modern internet myth collapses upon itself.
Yes, let's lay them side by side.
Okay, on one side we have Ari in the 1120s. He gives us a stark skeletal genealogy, a list of names that simply begins with Yngvi, king of the Turks.
Right.
And on the other side we have Snorri in the 1220s. He gives us a sprawling geopolitical narrative. He gives us Odin, Iceland, Turkland, Roman imperial pressure, and a dramatic northern settlement.
The crucial point here is that while these two traditions are undeniably related, they share deep cultural motifs and a shared fascination with an Eastern origin, but they are distinct texts
Written by different men.
in different centuries
Yeah.
for completely different purposes.
I can already anticipate the pushback from a skeptical listener, though. Someone listening might say, well, okay, sure, they are two different texts. But if Snorri explicitly states that Odin came from Turkland and had vast estates there, isn't that practically the same thing as saying Odin was a Turkish king?
I hear that argument a lot.
Right. Isn't the viral internet claim basically just mashing two historically accurate texts together to make a point that is fundamentally true?
And that specific line of reasoning is exactly how complex medieval history degrades into misleading internet fodder.
How so?
Because Snorri's humanized chieftain Odin is fundamentally not Ari's ancestral figure Yngvi. When a modern reader forcefully merges these two texts, they obliterate the historical evolution of the concept.
They flatten it.
Exactly. You are taking a static genealogical framework from the early 12th century and violently cramming it into a dynamic geopolitical migration narrative from the 13th century.
It would be like taking a silent black and white film from the 1920s, digitally splicing it into a heavily choreographed action sequence from a 2020s blockbuster, and presenting the final product as a single, authentic historical artifact.
That's a perfect analogy.
You have completely destroyed the evidence of how the story, the culture, and the literature actually grew and changed over those intervening decades.
Right. Ari represents a much older structural tradition. Snorri represents a later attempt to rationalize that structure and seamlessly integrate it into the broader accepted history of the world.
Specifically the era of Roman dominance.
Exactly. However, we cannot ignore the glaring commonality that links both authors. Whether it is Ari in the 1120s or Snorri in the 1220s, both of these Icelandic scholars possess a deep, undeniable fixation on an Eastern homeland.
And both prominently feature variations of the word Turks, or Turkland.
Yes. And this brings us to what might be the single most dangerous trap in the study of medieval history, which is the geographical trap.
We have to ask a very difficult question here. What did the word Turk actually mean to a man freezing in an Icelandic scriptorium in the 12th century?
Because one thing is absolutely certain, he was not looking at a modern map of the world.
No, definitely not.
This is where modern assumptions create historical chaos. When a modern listener hears the word Turks, they instantly, almost involuntarily, conjure a specific mental framework.
Sure, they envision the modern political borders of the Republic of Turkey.
Exactly. They picture a specific modern ethnic group.
Right.
Or, if they have some historical background, they might picture the Turkic-speaking Seljuk Empire that was expanding across Anatolia during the medieval period.
But that's a mistake.
A huge mistake. The fundamental error is projecting a precise, rigid, 21st century cartography backward in time onto a medieval mind.
You cannot read an 800-year-old manuscript with Google Earth open in the background.
You really can't.
It will lead you to completely false conclusions. To understand Ari or Snorri, we have to mentally rebuild their map of the world. We have to figure out what was actually shaping their geography.
So the medieval mental map was not based on satellite imagery, precise surveying, or fixed political borders. It was a fluid, chaotic, and heavily layered composite of several different streams of information.
What's the first layer?
First and foremost, you had biblical descriptive geography. The medieval worldview was profoundly ordered by Christian scripture. Maps of the time, often called TO maps, placed Jerusalem squarely at the center of the world. The world was divided among the three sons of Noah.
Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Yes, representing Asia, Africa, and Europe. This biblical framing dictated that the most ancient and important origins inherently lay to the east.
So layer one is theology. The Bible essentially forces the compass needle to point east toward Eden and the ancient patriarchs. What is the second layer?
The second layer consisted of the remnants of classical antiquity. specifically Roman derivations of ancient Greek geography.
Like Pliny the Elder.
Exactly.
Okay.
These surviving texts often use sweeping, generalized, and highly inaccurate terms for the vast confederations of peoples living beyond the edges of the quote-unquote civilized Mediterranean world.
They just lumped everyone together?
Yeah, they used blanket labels like Scythians to describe almost anyone living on the Eurasian steppes.
And layer 3 would be their own local oral traditions, right? The genealogical lists and ancient myths we just talked about, which already had their own internal logic and geographical assumptions.
Correct. And the fourth, perhaps most fascinating layer, consisted of scattered, highly distorted reports from the contemporary Far East, brought back to Scandinavia by physical travelers.
Because we have to remember the incredible reach of the Norsemen.
We really do. We are talking about traders, explorers, and heavily armed mercenaries. The most famous example is the Varangian Guard.
Oh, we absolutely have to explain the Varangian Guard because they are the physical bridge between the icy north and the Byzantine east.
Yes, they are crucial to this.
For those listening who might not know, these were elite bands of Norse warriors who traveled from Scandinavia, crossed the Baltic Sea, and sailed their longships down the massive river systems of Eastern Europe.
The Dnipros and the Volga rivers.
Exactly. They traveled all the way through what is now Russia and Ukraine until they reached the Black Sea and finally arrived at Constantinople, which they called Miklagard.
The great city.
Yeah. And they served as the personal axe-wielding bodyguards to the Byzantine emperor.
It's an amazing history. And during their journeys down those rivers, and during their service in the Byzantine Empire, these Norsemen encountered a vast array of nomadic cultures on the Eurasian steppes.
Like the Pechenegs and the Kipchaks.
Yes, and increasingly the advancing Turkic empires. When these Varangian veterans eventually returned to Scandinavia, retiring with their wealth, they brought back tales of massive eastern armies, strange lands, and powerful foreign rulers.
So Ari's map of the world is a patchwork quilt. It is a collage stitched together from the Book of Genesis, leftover Roman maps, local campfire stories, and the exaggerated bar tales of retired mercenaries who had served the emperor in Constantinople.
That is the perfect way to summarize it. Because of this chaotic blending of sources, modern historians have made it abundantly clear that the appellation of the Turks in Ari's era was incredibly fluid and vague.
It wasn't a strict border.
No, it was a geographic label that drifted loosely across their mental maps.
Yeah.
We cannot say with any academic precision that when Ari wrote Turks, he was referring specifically to the Turkic-speaking Seljuks of Anatolia.
Right.
In medieval European literature, the term frequently functioned as a blanket descriptor for a powerful, exotic, and often nomadic peoples residing in the distant east or southeast of the known world.
The best way I can conceptualize this for you listening is to look at a much more recent historical blunder. Think about how early European explorers arriving in the Americas called the indigenous populations Indians.
Right, a classic example.
Their mental map was rigidly, obsessively fixed on finding a western sea route to India. When their ships hit land, they simply applied the geographical label they already had preloaded in their minds.
Regardless of the staggering reality on the ground.
Exactly. A medieval writer using a specific word does not mean they are looking at the exact same geographical reality that you are. The word Turk meant something entirely different inside a cold Icelandic scriptorium than it does on a modern political map.
That analogy captures the mechanism perfectly. The label was applied based on a preconceived geographical expectation. However, we must not make the mistake of assuming the term in Ari's or Snorri's work is meaningless.
It still meant something to them.
It carries immense, undeniable symbolic weight.
Even if it doesn't represent the modern Republic of Turkey, it means something vital to the author.
It meant a domain of ancient power located beyond Scandinavia, toward the east. It was a directional marker indicating prestige, antiquity, and martial strength.
Okay, I see.
The use of the word proves that the foundational framework for these Icelandic writers, the very roots of their cultural identity, extended far beyond the harsh, icy shores of the north and pointed relentlessly toward the eastern horizon.
Now, this geographical trap, the trap of retroactively forcing modern political maps onto ancient texts, it isn't just a mistake made by casual internet users.
No, it is not.
It actually ensnared a highly educated, deeply influential historian in the 18th century, and it led to one of the most spectacular historical blunders in the entire history of Norse scholarship. We need to talk about Sven Lagerbring.
Sven Lagerbring is a fascinating figure who perfectly illustrates the dangers of misapplied methodology. He was a prominent Swedish historian operating during the Enlightenment.
What did he do?
Well, in 1764, he published a historical pamphlet titled Sveriges Historien. To understand Lagerbrink, we must understand the intense pressure of his era. In the 18th century, European nations were becoming utterly obsessed with uncovering, or honestly inventing, grand origins for themselves.
Right, nation building.
Exactly. The nascent nation-states wanted ancient, glorious ancestors to legitimize their modern existence.
It was a period of intense imperial competition. Sweden had recently been a massive European power, and scholars like Lagerbrink felt immense nationalistic pressure to prove that the Swedish people had a history just as deep and magnificent as the Greeks or the Romans.
Yes, the stakes were high for them.
So Lagerbrink sits down with the very texts we are discussing today. He reads Ari the Learned. He reads Snorri Sturluson's Ynglinga saga. He sees the line Yngvi, king of the Turks.
He reads about Snorri's Odin abandoning his massive estates in Turkland.
Then Lagerbrink decides he has solved the puzzle.
He genuinely believed he had. He sent his pamphlet to a colleague, a renowned linguist named Johan Ira, boldly arguing that the ancestral Swedes actually migrated directly from Turkey.
Just a straight line from Turkey to Sweden.
Yes. Lagerbrink blindly accepted the old Icelandic traditions at face value, without stopping to critically evaluate the nature of medieval literature or geography. He viewed the mythological figure of Odin not as a god, but as the historical head of a massive family of peoples he explicitly called Turkjar and Asiamen.
Turks and Asians.
Exactly.
He literally read a 13th century saga, looked at an 18th century map of the Ottoman Empire, pointed to Turkey, and said, that is our true homeland.
That is exactly what he did.
But he didn't just base it on the sagas, did he? He thought he possessed empirical, scientific proof to back up his massive geographical leap. He thought he could prove this eastern migration through the science of linguistics.
Lagerbrink attempted to prove his theory by comparing the Swedish language directly to the Turkish language. He scoured dictionaries and began identifying words in both languages that sounded vaguely similar and shared similar meanings.
Which sounds logical on the surface.
To an 18th century mind operating before the formalization of modern historical linguistics, this seems like irrefutable, conclusive proof. The logic was simple. If our ancient ancestors migrated from Turkey, our modern languages should still share vocabulary.
So he just made a list.
He compiled a list of these similarities, presented them as evidence, and considered the case of Swedish origins effectively closed.
But his methodology was, to put it mildly, an absolute disaster.
It was terrible.
It is a masterclass in how not to conduct historical or linguistic research. We need to deconstruct exactly why his theory collapsed, because it highlights three massive leaps in logic that people still make today when reading ancient history. What was Lagerbrink's first fatal error?
His first leap was entirely geographical. He committed the exact error we just discussed. He collapsed the fluid, mythologized medieval concept of Turkland directly onto the fixed borders of modern Turkey.
He missed all the nuance.
Completely. He treated a vague, directional marker of Eastern prestige as a clean, one-to-one reference to the national identity of the contemporary Turks. He failed to account for the biblical, classical, and cultural layers that constructed the medieval mental map.
He ignored the TO map and just used a globe. So that is leap number one, catastrophic map reading. What was the second leap?
His second leap was chronological and textual. Lagerbrink violently collapsed the bare genealogy of Ari's Yngvi with Snorri's elaborate account of Odin's migration.
He mashed them together.
Yes. He took two fundamentally different texts, written a full century apart, created for different political purposes featuring different primary actors, and fused them together into a single, cohesive, chronological timeline.
He essentially did exactly what the viral internet meme does today.
It's the exact same process.
He mashed conflicting sources together, sanding down all the awkward edges, just to make his grand narrative work. And what was his third, and arguably most destructive, leap?
His third leap was methodological. His linguistic proof relied entirely on surface-level word similarities between Swedish and Turkish.
We really need to unpack this linguistic angle. Because to a layperson, Lagerbrink's logic sounds relatively sound. If two distinct languages have a bunch of words that sound almost exactly the same and mean the exact same thing, common sense dictates they must be historically related.
It seems like common sense, yes.
So why does surface-level similarity mean absolutely nothing to a modern historical linguist?
Because human language is incredibly messy, and the human vocal tract is physically limited. There are only so many sounds we can produce.
Right.
When a linguist sees similar words in two languages, they know it could be the result of a historical connection, but it could equally be the result of completely unrelated phenomena.
Like what?
It could be an original borrowing, like a
Yeah.
loanword picked up through trade. It could be pure chance. Or it could be convergence, where two entirely unrelated languages independently develop similar sounds for common concepts, often due to the physical ease of articulation or onomatopoeia, mimicking the sounds of nature.
To make this incredibly clear for you listening, I have a perfect example that linguists love to use. The English word bad, meaning poor or unacceptable, and the Persian word bad, spelled B-A-D, also meaning poor or unacceptable, sound exactly the same and mean the exact same thing.
It's a striking coincidence.
A layperson looking at that would instantly assume English and Persian must have borrowed from each other, or that one descended from the other. But historical linguists have traced the etymology of both words and proven conclusively that they evolved completely independently of one another.
Completely independent.
It is a total, mathematically guaranteed coincidence. If you built a grand theory of ancient migration based on the shared word bad, you would be completely embarrassingly wrong.
That is an excellent illustration of the problem. Reliable historical linguistics cannot be conducted by simply scanning two dictionaries for lookalikes.
It's just not science.
No, it's not. Lagerbring's approach was akin to finding two strangers on the street wearing the exact same red jacket and definitively concluding they must be biological brothers, completely ignoring the far more likely reality that they just shopped at the same store or that red jackets are simply common.
Right.
Modern linguistics requires systematic evidence. Linguists look for regular, predictable patterns of sound shifts over long periods of time.
Like Grimm's law, right, where linguists proved that ancient Indo-European P sounds systematically shifted to F sounds in Germanic languages, which is why the Latin word pater relates to the English word father or Pisces relates to fish.
Exactly.
It is a mechanical, mathematical shift, not just a random similarity.
Precisely. To prove a genetic relationship between languages, you must establish consistent sound laws. You require security in terms of chronology, knowing precisely when certain phonetic sounds existed in a specific language's history.
You can't just guess.
And you require a plausible, historically documented route of transmission. Gathering a handful of words that sound similar is absolutely not determinative evidence for an ancient national identity.
So Lagerbrand's grand theory collapses spectacularly under modern scrutiny. His geography was anachronistic, his textual analysis was clumsily blended together, and his linguistic mathematics amounted to pointing at random coincidences in a dictionary.
His methodology entirely fails to meet the standards of modern historical or linguistic examination.
But this is where the conversation takes a vital pivot, because it would be incredibly easy for us to sit here, mock Sven Lagerbrand's 18th century pamphlet, toss it in the historical trash bin, and confidently say, well, that was a ridiculous idea.
But we cannot do that.
Right. Because while Lagerbrand's methods were undeniably flawed, the fundamental question he was trying to answer is actually still profoundly valid.
This is a crucial distinction. Modern historical summaries often skirt past Lagerbrand's work entirely, dismissing him as a product of misguided nationalism.
Which he was, partly.
Sure, but Lagerbrand possessed the intellectual courage to ask the massive question that the Icelandic texts were practically begging the reader to ask.
If we clear away the debris, if we remove the fabricated internet quote about Odin, if we discard Lagerbrand's terrible linguistic math, we are still left standing face to face with a very stark, undeniable historical reality.
We are. And that reality is that the ancestral framework of early Scandinavia, in its oldest and most revered recorded forms, continually and stubbornly extended toward the east.
Let's synthesize the actual evidence we have explored today. Let's look at the solid ground we can actually stand on. What do we know for absolute certain?
We know three distinct interconnected things. First, we know that Ari the Learned, writing the earliest history of Iceland in the 1120s, deliberately chose to begin his elite royal lineage with an Eastern ruler title, Yngvi, King of the Turks.
Oh, that's one.
Second, we know that Snorri Sturluson, writing a century later, deliberately placed the great god Odin in a vast Eastern world defined by movement, battle, and geopolitical pressure in Turkland and Iceland.
That's two.
And third, we know that the North preserved a powerful origin story, transmitted across multiple generations, various authors, and distinct texts that consistently, almost obsessively, kept looking east.
The compass needle of Norse origins is stuck pointing east. It is an unavoidable feature of the literature. So now we must delve into the why.
Yes, the big why.
Why did later readers and writers feel this overwhelming compulsion to turn Yngvi into Odin? Why did divine gods absorb the identities of earlier human rulers? What psychological or historical forces were at work in the collective memory of the Scandinavian people that produced these specific geographically distant stories?
It points to something much deeper than mere political propaganda. It strongly suggests the presence of a profound, enduring ancestral memory of migration.
Like a cultural scar.
Exactly. We must remember that these were populations whose distant ancestors had been deeply unsettled and on the move for centuries during the migration period.
Right, the fall of Rome.
Yes, this was an era defined by the collapse of the Roman world, the terrifying westward advance of the Huns, and the chaotic movement of Germanic tribes through the river networks and steppes of Eastern Europe.
That level of generational trauma and massive geographical displacement leaves a mark on the cultural memory. That memory of movement from distant, exotic lands was retold around hearth fires, passed down from parents to children, recited by poets over and over again for hundreds of years.
It becomes foundational.
And as a story is retold across centuries, the rigid boundaries between historical fact and religious myth simply dissolve.
The mechanics of oral tradition ensure that over time, a highly successful chieftain is elevated into a legendary king. As more time passes, that legendary king is elevated into a divine founder.
And eventually that founder is worshipped as a god.
Exactly. Simultaneously, the distant half-remembered land they originally migrated from is slowly transformed in the cultural memory into a mythical, golden realm of unparalleled wealth and ancient magic.
When these medieval authors finally sat down to write their genealogies, they placed gods, human rulers, legendary founders, and modern dynasties all in the exact same breath because, to their minds, ultimate power and true legitimacy required deep, ancient, and distant roots.
It reveals a profound truth about how societies understand themselves.
Hmm.
It demonstrates that the modern concept of a completely isolated, pure, indigenous local origin is very often a much later political invention.
Right.
These early Icelandic texts, despite their confused geography and mythologized history, depict a world that instinctively felt connected to much broader Eurasian movements.
I think this speaks so powerfully to the human condition. It shows us how humanity constructs its own origins. We build these massive, complex, beautiful structures of myth, of royal genealogy, and ancestral memory to figure out where we belong in the chaos of the world.
We absolutely do.
We have a fundamental need to tie ourselves to something ancient and grand. And for the early Scandinavians writing these texts, that grandness wasn't found in their own backyard. It was located somewhere over the distant eastern horizon.
The East was the direction of ancient magic, the old gods, and the dawn of their people.
Ari's single sentence is so potent, not because it provides us with a simple biological answer, but because it simply refuses to disappear from the historical record. It continuously forces us to grapple with the reality of their Eastern gaze.
It forces us to ask better questions.
Yngvi, king of the Turks. It is just a handful of words, a wrong name repeated millions of times by the modern internet. But when you actually unpack it, it opens a door that leads much, much farther east than most people ever expect when they picture the Viking Age.
It really does.
And it leaves you with a thought to mull over long after we sign off today. If an entire civilization, sitting in the freezing isolation of the North Atlantic, felt the deep, compelling need to root their most powerful gods and their greatest kings in a land far outside their own borders, what does that say about the human need to belong to something larger than the ground we stand on?
It's a huge question.
If the gods themselves were conceptualized as immigrants fleeing ancient empires, maybe the very idea of a pure, isolated local origin was always a myth from the very beginning.
That is a perspective that entirely reorients how we view the construction of the past.
Be sure to follow the full investigation and source material, as well as download the official briefing for each episode absolutely free at woodensman.com. TikTok, YouTube at I Am Woodenman, Facebook, Instagram at Woodensman. Lastly, all of this is made possible by the upcoming book, The Quest for the Historical Odin, written by soldier-turned-researcher Christopher T. Knight. The book is set to be released December 1st, 2027, along with the short film Woden.